Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making, and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/childwelfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at The Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. On this week's podcast, Terri Sorensen, CEO of Friends of the Children, joins us to talk about professional mentoring of youth, how her organization's approach has developed over the years, and the insane run of major gifts that Friends of the Children has seen of late and what they're going to do with those. Before we get to that, let's do a few headlines, and we'll start off talking about two interesting things that were put out by the Biden administration of late. So late last month, the Administration for Children and Families put out a letter to colleagues that gave a status report on implementation of the Family First Prevention Services Act. That is an issue in legislation that we've talked about recently on the podcast with Heather Baker of Public Consulting Group. The Family First Act was passed in 2018, so we are at the 5-year mark. As of the end of February, according to this letter to colleagues from ACF, 39 states, the District of Columbia, and 3 Native American tribes had their plan approved for prevention services under the Family First Act, which means they could tap into the Title IV entitlement, which kind of heretofore had largely been used for paying the cost of foster care and adoption subsidies. Now these 39 states with approval, plus the tribes in D.C., can pay for certain services to prevent the need for foster care in child welfare cases. Now, as we've discussed before, the services can be selected from the list approved by the Federal Prevention Services Clearinghouse, which so far has cleared 65 different programs that touch on one or more of kind of 3 buckets of services: mental health interventions, substance abuse treatment, and in-home parenting skills. And those programs aren't just approved, they are also rated by the strength of the evidence that supports them. So the highest rating is well supported, the second highest is supported, and the third tier of approved services in the Family First Act is called promising. Now, in this letter out to the field, which I will include in our show notes, ACF helpfully kind of breaks down how many programs fit into each bucket: mental health, substance abuse, and in-home parenting skills, and then which of these programs are being listed the most by states after they've gotten approval or in their prevention plans. So the numbers point to a trend that I think might need addressing or discussion at some point as they figure out maybe a next wave of rewrites or regulations around Family First. So currently, of the 65 approved programs, well-supported programs make up 26% of that list, so 17. And then supported makes up 25% of the list. So there's 17 well-supported programs, 16 supported programs, and then the other 32, so about half of the whole total, are promising programs. Now, so far, there are 39 states and tribes in D.C. that have gained approval for their prevention plans. They have cumulatively chosen or identified 189 services that they intend to use. And of those 189 services, I counted this up myself using a spreadsheet. This wasn't in the letter. 87% of those come from the well-supported category. So just 7% of what has been identified for use by states is supported, and just 6% is promising. So on the one hand, it's rational that the well-supported group gets so much love. It has a lot of services that are time-tested, have lots of data to back up efficacy. And the law says that any state has to actually have 50% of their prevention spending be on this group of well-supported programs, right? You have to use half of your prevention money through 4E on the well-supported group. All that alone, I don't think explains fully why it's the case that almost 90% of the identified services, in total across these states, tribes, and DC are going to well-supported. There might be a few other factors playing a role. Here are two of them. First, the stuff with more evidence in general is also probably the same or a very similar list to the programs where the bones of the model exist in a state. So, for example, a lot of home visiting models where professionals are going into the homes of new or expecting parents to help them out. A lot of these home visiting models that have made the Family First, approved clearinghouse list are among the most used already. So in most states, or in a lot of states, one or more of those models are already in play. Similar with some of the more popular interventions, especially on the child behavioral health side, like functional family therapy, multi-systemic therapy. There's a good chance that a state has at least some providers with expertise and track record in providing those. So tapping into a federal, reimbursement around that makes sense right off the bat. Second, it is possible and even quite easy for a state to avoid the cost of doing additional evaluation and tracking of well-supported services. You're allowed to kind of seek a waiver that enables you to not have to track and evaluate any of the well-supported stuff you're doing, because what really can be accomplished by doing it, I guess, practically through the law, there's not a higher tier than well-supported. So I guess the rationale around that is what is the point of the tracking? I mean, for the programs there is, but for states, there's not another level that they can get to. So you can kind of plug those well-supported in and play, whereas for supported and promising programs, you really have to do some evaluating, tracking, and reporting outcomes to the federal government. And this was pretty explicitly made clear in Minnesota's plan, for example. They ultimately specified in their state plan, that they decided only to list well-supported programs for which the ongoing evaluation could be waived, so that they were not in a position where they would have to pay the cost of tracking things that were in the supported or promising list. The problem is that creates kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts for the rest of the services, and for the majority of services, since half of them that have been cleared by the clearinghouse are in the promising bucket. That's the bucket of approved things that need the most additional evidence for their efficacy. So you see what I mean by a self-fulfilling prophecy? I mean, these aren't already in states to the extent that well-supported services are, so they won't get into states as a result of that. They don't have a large body of research around them as compared to well-supported or supported programs, and nobody wants to help to pay to grow the body of evidence. So it's not really a super damning problem. I think most states are probably just acting rationally as they start out small, but this might be something that needs to be addressed if the interest is in, states having more of an attraction to trying out new things that are not currently in the state that might be on that supported or promising tier. One additional thing, they also listed some kind of new policy guidance or answers that the Biden administration had come up with in response to things that they had heard from states and stakeholders around the Family First Act. And I wanted to highlight one that Heather Baker brought up when she was on our podcast. She had expressed concern around the idea that this concept of who is eligible for the prevention services, who is a child that's a candidate for foster care because they're at imminent risk of experiencing maltreatment. She pretty rightfully, I think, brought up a real concern about the idea of trying to essentially like diagnosing or labeling children and, in connection to those children, their parents, as being imminently at risk of committing maltreatment or experiencing maltreatment. The letter includes an answer to that by simply saying that it is not incumbent on child welfare agencies to actually put on paper and describe to parents this concept of being at imminent risk. In fact, they sort of, without saying it, suggest that agencies don't do that. Here, I'm just going to read real quickly from what they say. Good practice dictates that Title 4E agencies approach families with integrity. The 4E agencies should consider potential practice implications related to family engagement and agency transparency with involved families when providing prevention services. So what they're saying there is basically this imminent risk concept is for the process. It is not something you need to engage parents on to explain or tell them that the view of them is that, but for a service, it's a fait accompli that you are going to abuse or neglect your child. A second bit of news out of the Biden team, I'm really not sure what this part means yet, but relates to the ongoing saga of getting new national data on some key aspects of child welfare practice and outcomes in America. So most of our child welfare listeners will know what the term AFCARS means, right? It's the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. We get an AFCARS, national top line report every year out of the feds that kind of identifies how many kids are in care and what their demographic breakdown are, where they're exiting to, entering, some of the reasons associated with their entry into foster care. And the full scope of what is collected under AFCARS is kind of badly in need of an update. It really hasn't had one in decades now. For example, there's nothing collected in AFCARS around the Indian Child Welfare Act. There's nothing in there about educational outcomes or educational stability for foster youth. A lot of people think that should be in there. Sexual orientation and gender identity is another one that there's certainly advocates who believe we should be obtaining better, clear data around the country about, and other things as well. And so to try and encapsulate, now almost like a decade of back and forth on this, the Obama administration put together a fairly robust, long list of new data elements that states were going to have to collect through the AFCARS process right on their way out the door. It was like just a couple of weeks before the Trump administration took over and were inaugurated. So the Trump administration froze that rule essentially in place, along with scores of other rules and regulations that the Obama administration had done at the last minute. And then they essentially rewrote the rule around AFCARS data collection with far less elements. So it still added some stuff about the Indian Child Welfare Act. It eliminated entirely, for the most part, collection around education outcomes, eliminated the sexual orientation and gender identity stuff. It did include the adoption disruption data, which we've been waiting for forever for now. So anyway, the Trump folks put out a new rule and then were promptly taken to court by a large group of tribes and advocacy organizations to challenge their elimination of the Obama rule, which would have been more robust and collected more stuff. So that is still in court as far as I know today, which sort of weirdly means that the Biden administration has inherited defense of Trump's rule from Trump, right? Like, so they are the government in court. And, we've discussed it on the podcast before, but presumably the outcomes that could happen in court, I guess, are either the judge rules for, essentially for the Trump rule and, chucks the lawsuit, in which case that Trump rule stands. And I guess we move forward with a plan to kind of collect that. I guess if that rule gets struck down, or I guess the Biden administration just, settles, one possible outcome could be that the Obama rule, which I guess would have been the last one to be finalized, becomes the law of the land, so to speak, as a regulation, and states have to move on that. So what happened that was a little odd at the end of last week was the Biden administration sought a 3-year extension of the Trump AFCARS plan, which it posted in the Federal Register. It also asked for a new round of public comment on the rule, which again is still tied up in this lawsuit in court. So seemingly on its face, that doesn't jive with what I'm hearing from several kind of credible sources around the administration, which is that Biden is going to put together their own plan for AFCARS data that I'm betting will look a lot like the old Obama one, right? It'll be more data elements, it'll be more inclusive of ICWA, sexual orientation and gender, maybe some stuff related to the Family First Act in there, which had not passed by the time the Obama administration was moving out of office. So it's all weird. Just a guess on my part is that perhaps this is kind of bureaucratically necessary somehow to keep, moving towards a new rule that the Biden administration wants to put out without this old Trump one taking effect. I guess if you just extend the runway on implementing it for the states and you ask them to give the administration new comment, you kind of kick the can down the road on that. It came out last week. I had a chance to read it on Friday. I'm not sure if anybody saw it before that, so we'll ask around and see what people know. But again, I did, everything I've heard indicates that the Biden administration is planning to do its own version of AFCARS. Now, the lingering question on all this to me is, no matter what the new data elements are, when are we going to start to see them? Because this whole thing will potentially result in yet another delay of onset for the new data. Or, I guess we could reasonably insist that states start collecting right away on the pieces that have been in both the Obama administration and Trump plans. That is, there's dozens and dozens of elements that have been in both of those rules, and I'm sure will be in Biden's. So people have known that those are coming, literally since 2017 now. No reason to think they wouldn't have had a chance to begin preparing to collect those. But for anything new that Biden wants to put in there or put back in there from the Obama original rule or anything, if the plan is to then give everybody 3 years again to get ready to start collecting, we're talking about, somewhere closer to 2030 before we're getting a lot of new data from the AFCARS process, which is unfortunate. All right, last one for this week. It has been a long run with states going in one direction on the policies around the ceiling of the juvenile justice system, and that has been towards raising the age and including more older youth in their juvenile justice system. There are only 3 states left currently that consider 17-year-olds to be universally adults in the eyes of the law, though it's our Georgia, Texas, and Wisconsin. But now a bill is moving in both chambers of the Tennessee legislature that would, in fact, lower its age of jurisdiction to 17. So it would be the first state in a very long time to move backwards and actually lower the age, sort of. So it's a little bit of a weird process that is being proposed in these bills. It would still be, for the 17-year-olds, a juvenile delinquency petition, as far as I can understand from reading the bill today, which took a very long time to find. But the petition would always, for 17-year-olds, now begin in adult court with the choice for that court to kick it back down to the juvenile system if it wanted the juvenile courts. Same deal for youth even as young as 13, so 13, 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who were accused of certain serious crimes, murder, homicide, sexual assault, things like that. Those cases would do the same thing. They'd originate in criminal court, and there would be a decision as to whether or not it should proceed there or not. So in commenting on this bill, one of its co-authors, Representative Mary Littleton, said some crimes committed by juveniles are so heinous that they should be treated the same as adult crimes. We've heard that phrasing before, adult time for adult crime. The purpose of this legislation is to hold violent juveniles accountable for their actions and promote public safety, which would seem to be an argument for automatically transferring youth for heinous crimes like murder and rape. But this bill seems to do that for youth, again, as young as 13. And then for the 17-year-olds, it just mandates that all 17-year-olds for any crime across the board will originate in the adult court. So many of the local stories reference that the bills are propelled by an increase in juvenile crime. Some even throw, the word skyrocketing around. But none of those stories seem to actually back that up with a numerical or percentage change in juvenile crime or arrests or accusations or anything. One fact so I read through a lot of different pieces around this, and one fact that crops up a lot is that according to Memphis police, 70% of the youth arrested for car theft have a record. Okay. Is that more or less than usual? Are there more car thefts pinned to youth than usual? Is the adult system more likely to handle the previous offense of those youths accused of car theft differently than juvenile court? I think the implied assumption is that if they had been arrested before in adult court, they'd have been in jail and then in prison, so they wouldn't have committed the car theft. I'm not sure that premise really holds up. What percentage of adults arrested for car theft have a record? I'm going to guess if it's 70% for youth, pretty close to 100% probably for adults who are arrested for car theft. So, look, this is not to say that there is not some issue or something to pay attention to in the nature of the process for juvenile justice in Tennessee or huge counties like Shelby County, where Memphis is, or Davidson County. But the idea of just throwing that, attribution, like rising crime, juvenile spikes, therefore let's include all of these teenagers in the adult system. I mean, you kind of have to back that up with something if you're going to cite it. All right, when we come back, our interview with Terri Sorensen of Friends of the Children.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
We are joined today by Terri Sorensen, the longtime CEO of Friends of the Children, who has recently been made to actually answer for real the question most nonprofit CEOs get asked hypothetically, which is, what would you do with a truckload of cash? We'll talk about some major gifts the organization has received of late, mentoring, and more. Terri, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So we start everybody off the same, just so the listeners get to know you a little bit. You have to give me one of your favorites. You can give me more if you want. Here are the categories: movie, TV show, musical group, book, sports team. Terri Sorensen, what do you got?
Oh my gosh, so many choices. Okay, let's do movie.
Okay.
I'll do, I guess, one of my favorite movies that I've watched recently is called Swimmers on Netflix. It's based on a true story of two sisters who were born in Syria and trained for the Olympics. And then the war happens. And it's just a really inspiring movie that I would recommend.
That was a cool movie. I didn't recognize the name when you said it, but then once you started describing it, I watched that as well. That was really, I had no idea that it happened. And I had totally forgotten that we created, the world created that team for refugees, which is sad that we need that, but pretty heartwarming. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk first about what it is that you guys do, because I think, Friends of the Children has certainly grown its brand over the years, but there's probably a lot of people out there that don't really know what you guys are about. And I guess let's back up before that to you. You joined this organization a while back. I think, if I recall correctly, guys, you joined when I was still a Scut reporter at Youth Today, and I think I reported on you getting the job. But you came in from Sprint, right? You came in from the corporate world. What did you know about mentoring at all when you came into this job?
Sure. Well, I actually learned about Friends of the Children and became a donor several years before I came to work for the organization. And I was just so struck in meeting some of the friends who are paid professional mentors, and the work they do with children through no fault of their own. Were really, facing a lot of systemic challenges that they needed to overcome. And so I fell in love with the organization, became a donor, and then later was recruited to come in as the CFO. And my background was in accounting and finance. And so I felt very comfortable with that. Years later, where the executive director left and the board and our founder, Duncan Campbell, asked if I would fill in as the interim. And I said, happy to be the interim. And I'm taking the job full time. And of course, that was, I've now been here 20 years.
Amazing. That's amazing. So the scope of the people you serve, right, the children and families varies depending on the interests of the different sites and stuff. There's more general community relationships. I think you serve youth in foster care in some places. In others, you're a prevention strategy for keeping youth from coming into foster care. But let's set that aside and just talk about the approach in general. So I think one way that maybe would be helpful for listeners to envision what you guys do is just take a hypothetical child, call him whatever, him or her, whatever you want, and sort of take listeners through the moment that a child's paired with a friend all the way till the end of the road for them.
Sure. So, we select children at age 4 to 6, and it's a totally voluntary program. So I'll give you an example of, a child who might be identified through an early preschool program or through the foster care system where maybe there's been 2 or more calls to that child's family and they're saying this family needs a friend. And with a friend, the family has the support they need to not have the child go into foster care and be successful. So we approach the caregivers, whether that be the biological parents, foster parents, and we say, hey, we'd like to come alongside you, support you, both you and your child for 12 plus years, no matter what, your child's whole childhood. And, we want to do that because what hopes and dreams do you have for your child and for yourself? And we really find, in over 97% of cases that families have never been asked, what are your hopes and dreams for your child or yourself? And they say yes to the program, and we really meet them where they're at. And the friend will start working with a child 4 hours a week and at home, at school, and in the community. And that happens for 12 plus years, no matter what.
So, as the name given to the title, right, friend indicates, this is supposed to be a long, sustainable, emotional relationship for this child with a person. But to the side of simply them becoming friends in that way, are there things at different ages that you guys slot in as sort of more specific or targeted things that the adult mentor is going to do for the child, at different ages? Or do you kind of let it organically grow with each kid,
Yeah, it's very individualized. So early on, once a family says yes to the program, the friend works with the caregiver and the child to really figure out what are the individual needs and opportunities and challenges that each child is facing. And they develop a roadmap with goals that are revisited several times a year. And all of the intentional activities that a friend does with a child really are about building a powerful relationship, but also intentionally working on those goals. So, for example, a child might be very behind in reading. They love, robots. And so the friend, is ever thinking about how can I engage this child in reading, but in something they really love. And so they will work on building a robot, and the child is reading the instructions on how to build that robot, and that's building his reading skills and doing something he loves. The child typically doesn't even remember or know that that is intentional, what's behind it. They're just having fun building a robot, and as a result are also learning to read.
And then so like in all these places that you guys work, which I think there are 29 now, correct? Locations where Friends of the Children are. Who do the friends go to for training and advice? Is there sort of a lead friend in each place?
So nationally, we train all our friends in what's called New Friends Training, and used to be in person at our headquarters in Portland, Oregon before COVID, but now we do it all via Zoom, and friends from across the country are meeting, which is really important because I think it's important that they know that they're not alone. They're not the only ones as a friend, and they build relationships and have support as a group. But then at each local site, there's a program director, and that program director supervises the friends. There are regular team meetings every week where, friends can share the challenges or the successes they're having and learn from one another. and get new ideas on maybe how to vary their approach to meet a child and family where they're at.
What can you tell us about sort of the workforce in general, that front line of friends? I don't want to put you on the spot with like hard numbers, but just generally, what age range are most of the friends? What are your kind of demographics between, like, I'm just curious, like male, female, all that stuff?
Yeah, so we take an equal number of boys and girls into the program. And, at this point in time, we gender match based on, what the child identifies as their gender. So, we have an equal number of male and female friends doing this work. They are amazing people. They have typically a college degree or equivalent, at least 2 to 3 years experience of working with vulnerable children and families. And most have lived experience, that can really relate and build trust with the children and their families.
And when you say lived experience, I mean, I know that you guys have done much more work within the kind of child welfare space more recently. Is that what you mean? System experience with that, with child welfare?
Child welfare. Also, maybe grew up in poverty. Los Angeles, where we are primarily a prevention for parents who've aged out of the system, the foster care system, and now they have 4 to 6-year-olds. Their children are 60% more likely to go into foster care. And so many of our friends in Los Angeles have experienced child welfare themselves growing up and can really relate to the families. In Chicago, where gang violence is the biggest focus and we're seen as a gang violence prevention program, many of our friends have had experience, with family members or their own situation where they experienced gang violence. So it really is lived experience with kind of the problems we're trying to mitigate and solve through Friends of the Children in that community.
Got it. So you guys make a 12-year commitment to every child that comes in to work and receive a friend. And I'm curious, how often you guys are actually able to have the same friend, with a youth for that long. I guess I ask because we're just coming hopefully out of this period of, the Great Resignation. All over the social services and safety net infrastructure, we're seeing these huge issues with turnover and vacancies. And it strikes me as like, that's a really important part of your model, right? Is this commitment to like continuity with the kids. So how has that gone for you guys? Have you been able to, largely keep those pairings intact?
Plan is that a child will have no more than 2 to 3 mentors. Mm-hmm. And when we are hiring friends, we tell them, if you can't commit to at least 3 years, please don't take this job, because that will do more harm than good with our children. They have so many people coming in and out of their lives. And by asking for 3 years, the average friend stays 5 to 6 years. While we do have several who've gone all the way through and then seen a new group of kids to mentor, so we have folks who've been here 20 years or more. But for the most part, we're pretty proud of the fact that our friends stay 5 to 6 years, and they really do that because of the bond with the child and the family.
We gotta get a 20-year vet on the podcast at some point. That'd be an interesting retrospective on how working with or supporting a youth has changed over a pretty tumultuous couple of decades here, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll do that. If I remember correctly, there is correct me if I'm wrong on the years here, but you guys had a very well reviewed and rated assessment kind of early on, maybe like right as you were coming into the picture, from Public-Private Ventures. And then I think right at the same time, you guys kind of embarked on this mother of all evaluations, this 15-year randomized control trial. I think it's supposed to be coming out this year or next, correct? Like, I'm curious because I've just been very interested in that as we've covered Friends of the Children over the years. Have you gleaned some information from that already? Do we know when that information is going to be made available?
Yes. So in 2025 is when
2025. Okay.
Yes, all the kids will have graduated from that original randomized control trial because we enrolled them over a 3-year time period. There will be a write-up, but we have learned things along the way. And it's really led us to make some, I think, innovative and important changes to the program. We learned about halfway through that one of the biggest impacts was parents had a more positive view of their child. And that is critical in child welfare. I mean, that can make the difference between families staying together and not. And so we followed that up with Annie E. Casey Foundation doing a qualitative study. They did focus groups with our friends, our foster parents, as well as biological parents. And when they came back to us, they said, you're really having an impact much larger than on just the child. You're really benefiting whole families and the caregivers and the other siblings in the family by having a friend. And that led us to incorporate a 2-generational approach with our model. We call it 2Gen, but now in addition to serving the child, we are also very much supporting a caregiver, and they report that they don't feel alone. They feel more capable as a parent, and, giving them tools like our core assets that can benefit all of the children they have in their families, which the average family size is over 5. So we really found through the study that we were having a much larger ripple effect on the whole family than we would have thought.
And going back to something you mentioned kind of early on in the conversation here, is it accurate to say that whoever is contracting or working with you to be in a place and the dynamics involved, whether it's foster care or it's not, or it's prevention or it's in the system, is it always a voluntary proposition for you? No child and their parent is referred to friends of the children in the way of like, if you don't do this, we may remove a child or something. It's got to be purely voluntary.
Absolutely. We're pretty insistent on that. However, we do partner, with departments of mental health, like in LA County, with child welfare agencies across the country. And, we started out taking children in foster care, and, we were confident of that work because of our data over the last 30 years that showed the positive outcomes: graduation from high school, avoidance of juvenile justice, avoiding teen parenting. But at that point, when we, really heard from foster care systems that they wanted this model because we stay with kids as they move around as long as they stay within 30 miles, that was a big turning point for us. And I think what we learned was we really wanted to be on the side of prevention because so much trauma is caused when a child goes into the foster care system. And that's pretty hard to overcome. And if a caregiver or a parent has someone, cheering them on and by their side, it's much less likely to happen. In fact, in the Antelope Valley in LA County, where children are identified where there's been 2 or more calls to a hotline, but the family's still together, none of those children over the last 4 years have gone into foster care at all. So we're seeing really promising results with that prevention strategy. And we actually have launched a new randomized control trial to measure entry into foster care and the effect on caregivers. And that's happening in partnership with the University of Notre Dame's Lab for Economic Opportunity. And that's our 2-generation randomized control trial. And it's just kicked off with several of our sites participating. So we're happy to have a second randomized control. This one will only go 5 to 6 years. So not the entire 12 plus years of the program like our first one is.
Right. And I'm guessing the hope to some extent with that second evaluation is that it sounds like that might put you in line to be qualified for the Family First funding, right? If you can show results that say the participants, the families that work with us, they don't end up with kids in foster care, that's a pretty strong case to be made, right?
That is absolutely right. We have so much data, and we are on the California clearinghouse now. But, we still lack some of the criteria in some states to qualify for Families First funding. So this opens up additional dollars to expand the program, not only for children and families, but, we really have a goal in our business plan around systemic change. And we really think the power of this model can change the foster care system. And it's actually, we've put a stake in the ground to say we'd like to reduce 5-year-olds going into foster care by 10% by 2030. So, yeah.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, like they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
Your predecessor, Kathy Milton, came into that job. I know this only because we wrote about her experience before you took on the job. But I think if I remember in the details of our story on her, this was before I was with the imprint. This is back in the old Youth Today days. She got in there in this big map of 18 cities to expand to. And, they had just sort of lost 2 sites that had shut down. And she just said, whoa, we're going too fast here. We need to be more planful about how we grow this organization. What was her advice to you way back when you guys did the transition? And how do you now think through where are we going next and what does it take to bring Friends of the Children? What is the minimum that you guys need out of a community before you're going to commit to them?
Catherine is amazing. And in fact, I still talk to her at least once a year and seek her great advice. But I think we're a learning organization and we learned a lot about scaling and how to scale this program. And when I took over, we really did an assessment of lessons learned. And we saw that where chapters closed, it was because they started out underfunded and in many cases funded by just one entity, whether that was an individual, a foundation, etc. And so now, we really set parameters around, we raise $1 to $2 million depending on the size of the community that wants Friends of the Children to come there. And that's the other piece. We only go where we're invited, where folks have sought us out, and we do some feasibility and determine that there are champions who can make this program successful in their own community. Is there enough support from government funding, the business community, the school community, foster care systems that really will help make a chapter successful? And that $1 to $2 million that's raised, no more than 40% can come from any one funder. And the more funders that are involved in raising that, the more diverse and sustainable a chapter will be for the long term. So those were all lessons that we learned and we put into, our business plan that has allowed us to, grow to 29 locations around the country.
Okay, which brings us to probably the most fun part of this discussion for you, I'm sure, which is just the run you guys have been on with big gifts here, which I got to think would put you up against any youth serving organization. I'm sure somebody's gotten a bigger one-time bequeathment, right, in the history of youth work, but let me just tick these off for the listeners and let them get jealous of your guys' success here. So fill in the blanks if I miss any, but I think it was around 2018, 2020. A decent basketball player named Michael Jordan committed the profits, I guess, or his end of the documentary Last Dance to you guys. He's been a supporter before, I know that. Then a couple of years later, you get $44 million dropped on you from the Mackenzie Scott Bonanza, which plenty of other child welfare providers also and advocates or the grassroots folks got. And then more recently, you got this huge $33 million gift from the Rude family. They were successful investors in wealth management up in Oregon. So that is a heck of a run. I'm most curious about the Mackenzie Scott one first, because I'm just curious, like, where were you when you found out you were about to get $44 million that you had no idea was coming? Was it really secretly vetted? Like, did you have no idea?
I kept seeing all these national organizations who were much better known than Friends of the Children getting these big Mackenzie Scott gifts. And I knew that Bridgespan was doing the vetting for it. And I just kept saying to our team, when's our turn? And it was last February, so about a year ago, where I got an email from Bridgespan saying, we have a major donor who'd like to find out more. Will you do a call with me? And I just knew that this had to be Mackenzie Scott. And so I did that call with one of the Bridgespan folks. And then about a month later, I had a call from the CEO of Bridgespan. And he said, Mackenzie Scott has chosen Friends of the Children. She wants to give to you. I'd like your team to work with her, to work with my team to identify, she'll probably give to 6 chapters of Friends of the Children. And then you'll have an opportunity to write a letter on why National should also get funding if you choose to do so. So our team worked with the Bridgespan group, gave them all kinds of data and information. And then we set about writing the most compelling letter we could, sharing our expansion progress and what the need was and our goals around preventing foster care and our expansion into Native American and tribal communities around the country. And then we didn't hear anything, for about 6 weeks. And our newest expansion is actually on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which is the poorest county in the U.S. Yeah. And it's the poorest Indian reservation, obviously, in the U.S. as well. I got an email from the CEO of Bridgespan, after about 6 weeks, and he said, can you talk? And the cell service on the reservation was so poor that our director of tribal programs, she had to drive me to a spot where there would be 4 bars. I was standing in a ditch outside of her truck on the Pine Ridge Reservation when I heard we were going to get 44 million. So the contrast of, where I was and what we were trying to do, and it makes me emotional even now to learn that we were getting 44 million. It really was an incredible game changer.
What ended up happening with the Michael Jordan aspect in The Last Dance? Do you at this point, do you know how much? I'm sure there's like residual over time or whatever, but about how much did you guys get out of that?
Yes, well, I'm only at liberty to say it was a multi-million-dollar donation. It closed out a $25 million campaign that we had launched. So that's all I can say about that. So once Michael Jordan did that, we said, let's launch a $50 million campaign. And we thought it would take us till 2025 to raise that.
It took you about 10 minutes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So without prying more into the Michael Jordan part of it, suffice to say, you kind of came close to around $100 million coming from 3 sources, probably a little lower or higher than that, whatever. Now, what I want to know is you have this approach to expansion. You've got to get the buy-in and all of that. But now you've got this huge arsenal of money. And I guess it's got to be so tempting on one level to just be like, let's go out and just take over the world with support for kids. But of course, you got to be a little more planful than that. So how have you guys thought about, and what is the strategy for kind of using this now and in the future? Like, how have you guys been thinking about, that duality?
I think it's very tempting to say, let's put this away and save it to make sure the organization's sustainable. But we actually recognize that this problem of children going into foster care, it needs to be solved now, not later. And so we feel compelled to use this money over the next 5 to 7 years to do a couple of things. We're building a national center of excellence named after our founders, Duncan and Cindy Campbell, that will be here in Portland. And it'll be the only center of excellence on paid professional mentoring in the world. So we are very excited, about that aspect. We also made sure that all of our chapters received some funding from the Mackenzie Scott gift. And we took some of our national funding and we put that in what we call a chapter impact fund. And a good chunk of the Rood funding from Gary and Christine Rood is going in that as well. And our chapters can apply for that to grow their program, to build capacity, to serve more children in their own communities. And then also we use the dollars as expansion matches. So when we go into a community like we just launched in Houston, National was able to put up $500,000 to say to the local community, hey, we're in this with you. And, we always need local sources to match. We don't want our match to be any more than 40%, but that's really helping us expand across the country. And, we had a goal to be in 25 cities by 2025. And obviously we're in 29 now. So we've had to update our business plan. So now we're really looking at being in 45 communities by 2025.
That's how you will kind of measure some short-term success with this new windfall and everything that's going on there. If you guys are in 45 cities, that's the kind of North Star for you.
That is the goal for 2025. I'd say the North Star is to be in every state in the country. Our vision is that every child who needs a friend would have a friend, a caring adult in their life to come alongside them.
Every state. What state are you dying to get in that you're not right now? With apologies to all the others, I am putting on you the spot. Where do you feel like Friends of the Children needs to be that it's not right now?
Wow. Well, there are so many places, actually. I don't know that I could say just one. Alaska is one. There are over 250 tribes in Alaska. So there's, been need expressed, and we're pursuing that. We're not in major city like Atlanta, which is a hope, but, we are really working with sovereign nations too. And that's been a big learning experience, but the outcomes for children in tribal communities, for instance, in South Dakota, the high school graduation rate's 25% for Native youth. We just feel like we can have a big impact. So we go where we're needed most, and, where folks express interest in working with us.
When I think of the concept of paid professional mentoring, the two organizations that come to mind are you guys and Youth Advocate Programs, or YAP. Are there others that you network with? Are you guys all connected? Do you talk? Do you share intel? I know there's a national mentoring network. That's the bigger picture, but does that exist?
We believe in mentoring for everyone. We have a niche in that we, want to go where the children who have the most risk factors and the least amount of protective factors, receive a friend. But we support mentoring everywhere, and we work closely with the National Mentoring Partnership. In fact, David Shapiro, who just stepped down as
now with YMCA, right? Yeah,
he's on our national board. So we do get connected through there. We just had 2 different presentations as part of the National Mentoring Summit in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago. Last week, we had all our board chairs and executive directors in Washington, D.C. with over 56 meetings with congressional. So, we're big advocates for mentoring. We had 5,000 billboards across the country that were donated by Billups for National Mentoring Month. So highlighting Friends of the Children as well as National Mentoring Month. We'll do the same thing in May with National Foster Care and Mental Health Awareness Month. So we do really collaborate and work with other organizations.
Well, congrats on all the recent success, and we'll continue to keep an eye on Friends of the Children as it expands. Terri Sorensen, CEO of Friends of the Children, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks to Terri Sorensen of Friends of the Children for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voices Rising program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christina Joko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. We'd really appreciate if you would support our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handles @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.